Hey everyone, welcome back to Steve's View. What's happening in the United States right now isn't just another round of political fighting over policy or elections. Under the surface, there is something deeper and more structural taking shape, something that doesn't always make headlines in a direct way, but is increasingly shaping the direction of American democracy itself. And it revolves around a question most voters never consciously think about, but which determines who becomes president. Should America keep the Electoral College system as it is, or is the country slowly moving toward a de facto national popular vote system without formally amending the Constitution? That question sounds technical, almost academic, but in reality, it sits at the center of one of the most underappreciated political battles in the United States today. And what makes it even more significant is that it is not happening through a single dramatic vote in Congress or a constitutional convention. It is happening quietly state by state through legal agreements, political strategy, and long-term partisan calculation. To understand why this matters, you have to step back from the day-to-day political noise and look at the structure of the system itself. The United States does not elect its president by direct national vote. Instead, it uses the Electoral College system, a mechanism created at the founding of the country that assigns each state a number of electors roughly based on population, and then allows each state to decide how those electors are awarded. In most states today, it is a winner-take-all system. Whoever wins the popular vote in that state receives all of its electoral votes. This system has produced stable outcomes for most of American history, but it also creates a recurring controversy. It is possible for a candidate to win the national popular vote and still lose the presidency by failing to win key states. That has happened twice in modern political memory, in 2000 and 2016. And those two elections fundamentally changed how one of America's two major parties views the system. For many Democrats, the Electoral College is no longer seen as a neutral institution. It is increasingly viewed as a structural disadvantage that distorts national political representation. For many Republicans, however, it is seen as a safeguard of federalism, preventing the presidency from being determined solely by a handful of densely populated urban centers. This is not just a disagreement about rules. It is a disagreement about what the United States actually is: a single national democracy, or a federation of semi-sovereign states with their own political weight. And that disagreement is now moving from theory into practice through something called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. This compact is a legally binding agreement among participating states. The idea is simple in concept but complex in execution. States agree that once enough states join the compact to reach a total of 270 electoral votes, the number needed to win the presidency, they will all award their electoral votes to the winner of the national popular vote, regardless of how their own state voted. In other words, it would not formally abolish the Electoral College, but it would effectively neutralize it. Supporters argue that this is a clever constitutional workaround. The U.S. Constitution gives states broad authority to decide how they allocate their electors. Therefore, they argue states are simply exercising their rights within the existing system. Critics argue that this is not a neutral administrative adjustment, but a fundamental restructuring of presidential elections without a constitutional amendment. And because it is being done through coordinated state legislation rather than a national vote, they see it as a form of institutional bypass. What makes this debate particularly politically charged is not just the legal theory, but the political reality behind it. The compact has been primarily advanced in states controlled by Democrats, and it is widely understood that its success would likely benefit Democratic presidential candidates in future elections, because Democratic voters are heavily concentrated in large urban states with high population density. Republicans, therefore, tend to view the compact not as a neutral reform, but as a partisan strategy aimed at altering the rules of presidential competition without winning a constitutional amendment process, which would require broad bipartisan agreement and approval by 3/4 of the states. This is where the tension becomes more than theoretical, because neither side is simply debating fairness. They are debating long-term electoral advantage. And what is unfolding now is that this compact is gradually moving from a symbolic proposal into a partially operational political reality. Several states have already joined, others are actively considering it. And as more states align with the agreement, the total electoral vote count, represented by the compact, edges closer to the critical threshold of 270. At that point, something unprecedented would happen in American political history. A parallel electoral system would effectively exist inside the existing constitutional framework, and that raises a question that legal scholars still disagree on. If a state commits its electoral votes in advance through an interstate agreement and later changes its mind after an election, what happens? Is it legally binding? Can it be challenged in court? Can a governor refuse to certify it? These questions do not have fully settled answers, and that uncertainty is part of what makes this issue so politically explosive, because it introduces a scenario where a presidential election outcome could be contested not only in courts but in the administrative decisions of individual states. And that leads to a broader concern: fragmentation of electoral legitimacy. In a stable system, even losing candidates typically accept the legitimacy of the process. But if the process itself becomes contested, if different states interpret obligations differently, or if legal challenges delay certification, then the risk is not just political disagreement, but institutional confusion. This is why some critics describe the situation in dramatic terms, warning of a potential constitutional crisis. But it is important to be precise here. The United States is not currently in a constitutional crisis. What it is experiencing is something more subtle but potentially more consequential: a slow-motion contest over the architecture of presidential elections. And this contest is being shaped by a deeper political reality: polarization. In earlier eras, debates over electoral reform were often bipartisan or cross-partisan. Today, nearly every institutional question is filtered through partisan identity. That makes compromise more difficult, but it also makes structural change more likely to occur through indirect mechanisms rather than formal consensus. If constitutional amendment is too difficult, then states become the arena of transformation, and that is exactly what is happening here. But the Electoral College debate is only one layer of a broader transformation in American politics. Beneath it lies another tension: the increasing divergence between national popular vote outcomes and electoral outcomes. In a fully proportional system, winning the most votes nationally would guarantee victory. In the current system, strategy matters as much as raw numbers. Campaigns focus on swing states, not national totals. This creates a very different political geography, where a small number of battleground states effectively decide national leadership. This has always been a feature of the system, not a bug. But in a hyperpolarized environment, it becomes a source of constant dispute, and that dispute is now intersecting with a second structural issue: state-level political control over election rules. States are not only responsible for allocating electors, they also control voter registration systems, ballot access rules, district boundaries, and election administration procedures. This means that American elections are not governed by a single unified system, but by 50 separate systems operating under a shared constitutional framework. That design was intentional. It reflects the federal nature of the United States. But in a highly polarized era, it also means that political battles can shift rapidly between federal and state levels, which brings us to an important dynamic: the increasing strategic importance of state governments in national politics. In past decades, state-level elections were often seen as secondary. Today, they are central. Control of state legislatures and governors' offices can influence not just local policy, but the structure of national elections themselves. This is why debates over redistricting, election law, and voting procedures have become so intense. They are no longer just administrative issues. They are part of a larger struggle over political representation and long-term electoral advantage. And this is where the rhetoric often becomes more heated than the underlying legal reality. Opponents of reforms tend to describe them as unconstitutional or illegitimate. Supporters tend to describe them as necessary modernization or democratic correction. But the truth is more complex. Most of these changes operate within legal boundaries that were never designed to anticipate this level of strategic political competition. The Constitution does not explicitly prevent states from coordinating their electoral votes in this way. But it also does not clearly define the limits of such coordination. That ambiguity is what creates both opportunity and controversy. And that ambiguity is now being tested in real time. If the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact ever reaches full implementation, it would represent one of the most significant changes in American electoral practice since the founding of the Republic. Not because it changes the Constitution directly, but because it changes how the Constitution is functionally applied. That distinction matters, because constitutional systems are not defined only by written text. They are also defined by institutional practice over time. But there is another layer to this story that is often overlooked. Even if this reform effort succeeds, it does not eliminate political conflict. It simply shifts the terrain on which that conflict occurs. Instead of battleground states deciding elections, national vote margins would become the central focus. Campaign strategies would change, coalition building would change, political incentives would change. In other words, the system would not become less political. It would become political in a different way. And that raises a deeper question: what problem is actually being solved? Supporters of reform argue that the goal is to align the presidency with the national popular will. Critics argue that the goal is to preserve the balance between states and prevent dominance by population centers. Both arguments contain legitimate democratic concerns, but they reflect different definitions of democracy itself. Is democracy primarily about numerical majority rule at the national level? Or is it about a federal balance that ensures geographic and regional diversity in political power? The United States has never fully resolved that tension. It was embedded in the founding structure of the country, and in many ways, it has been managed rather than solved. What is different today is not the existence of that tension, but the intensity of political polarization surrounding it. Which brings us back to the present moment. What we are seeing is not a sudden rupture in the system. It is a gradual acceleration of long-standing structural disagreements. The Electoral College debate, state-level election reforms, and interstate coordination agreements are all expressions of the same underlying reality. The rules of political competition are no longer static. They are becoming part of the competition itself. And that has important implications, because when rules become part of political strategy, every change is interpreted through a partisan lens. Every reform is seen not just as procedural adjustment, but as potential advantage or disadvantage. That is how institutional trust erodes, not through a single moment of breakdown, but through accumulated suspicion over time. Still, it would be a mistake to assume that the system is collapsing. The United States has a long history of managing institutional stress without systemic failure. Courts intervene. States adapt. Political actors adjust strategies. And the system continues to function even under strain. But it would also be a mistake to assume that nothing is changing. Something is changing. Slowly, unevenly, and often indirectly. But the trajectory is clear. The structure of electoral politics in the United States is under sustained pressure, and multiple competing visions of reform are now actively in play. And the outcome is not predetermined. It will depend on elections, legal interpretations, political bargaining, and the willingness of institutions to adapt without breaking. In that sense, what is happening now is not a crisis, but a test. A test of whether a centuries-old electoral framework can continue to function in an era of extreme political polarization, legal innovation at the state level, and increasing strategic competition over institutional rules. And like most tests in political systems, it will not have a single moment of resolution. It will unfold gradually, over multiple election cycles, through a series of incremental decisions that together shape the future of American democracy. For now, the system still holds. Elections still produce results. Governments still transfer power. Courts still arbitrate disputes. But beneath that surface stability, the rules that structure those outcomes are being quietly renegotiated. And that is what makes this moment significant. Not because everything is about to change overnight, but because for the first time in a long time, the question of how America chooses its president is no longer settled. Thanks for watching.